Okay, should we begin? Yeah, great. Thank you everyone for joining this event today. I'm James Francham. I'm a journalist here at The Economist newspaper in London, or to be specific, a data correspondent, and I'm working mostly on the Britain section. The sun is shining, it is beautiful outside, and if you're working from home, as I did this morning, I expect you've soaked up some sunshine already. So I appreciate you coming in from the beautiful sunshine to attend. I'm delighted to be sharing today's seminar on remote work, and with it the launch of a super interesting new paper from the LSE, which provides some really good firm level evidence for the differential benefits of remote work. And this is a topic I think that still feels, even after years of debate, after 6 years now after the pandemic, that still feels somewhat unresolved. And there's been, I think, a lack of very UK specific evidence informing that debate, and that I think that's an important piece of the jigsaw that this paper solves. So I think what we do know is that remote and hybrid work have become embedded, I think you would say, in the UK economy. They're no longer just a pandemic response, but kind of a structural feature of how firms operate across the board. And I think for sure employees value flexibility, autonomy, the removal of the daily commute. I'm always struck, for example, about how quiet the Lizzie line is on my commute to Covent Garden from Leytonstone. And there seems no longer to be a rush hour anymore, for the most part. And many employees, many employers, and I think actually employees like me, remain somewhat concerned about the effect on productivity, about collaboration, innovation, and knowledge transfer. And I think to some extent, culture. I always kind of think of back to the kind of 2018, 2019 years of working at the Economist as kind of halcyon days of kind of the kind of workplace culture. But that's just me, perhaps. I don't know. But we're left, I think, with a central question, and that's the one that we're trying to discuss today. And to what extent does remote work make firms more productive, or does it expose weaknesses in how they're managed? And as I said, I think this report brings new firm level evidence from across the UK using survey data, firm level survey data, to help us understand not just whether remote work works, but which firms benefit, and crucially, why those firms are benefiting. And I think we've all familiar with the kind of return to office mandates from large firms like Amazon or Goldman Sachs and Stellantis, who I should say the majority shareholder of which owns a big chunk of The Economist. But The Economist editorial, for example, on the other hand, as you might expect for a liberal paper, gives its staff lots of flexibility to choose when to come in, and that's something I really value. And it's not really been clear actually whether those kind of mandates reflect a broader trend or a visible kind of just a visible subset of large companies. And I think beyond that, there's also kind of big implications for remote work, not just at the firm level, but for example, about how housing markets, how cities look, what cities look like, how labor markets function, and the effect perhaps on regional inequality across the UK too. Um, so I think today's conversation really sits at the intersection of business strategy and public policy. So let me discuss now how we'll kind of run this session. So we'll start with the 20-minute presentation of the paper's key findings from two of its authors, Riccardo Crescenzi. I'm sorry, I butchered your name, Riccardo, from the LSE, and Davide Rigo from the University of Birmingham. And then we'll have a 10-minute discussion from Paul Swinney from the Data City, who are one of my favorite data startups. They're based in Leeds, and they use micro-level data to tell interesting stories about innovation. And Paul will focus on the implications for local labour markets and cities, I believe. And then we'll have a short exchange, and we'll throw out a Q&A to you lot in the audience. So with that, let me hand over to Riccardo and Davide to take us through the findings from the paper.
Hey, fantastic. Thank you very much, James, for the introduction.
Pleasure.
You did most of the work for me since I wanted to add a few slides to introduce the topic. Just a few key facts before starting describing you the main evidence of the report. One key evidence about the UK is that remote work is really predominant work arrangement in our economy. Roughly 40% based on INS data of the workforce engage some time with hybrid or fully remote work arrangements. And this just highlights how important it's become since the pandemic, with the share of workers employed in remote work that has more than doubled. As James highlighted already, we have this interesting divergence in the ongoing debate about remote work. On one hand, we have employers that are some of them very vocal employers that we can see in the headlines of are really imposing return to the office mandates. On the other hand, we have employees that are actually really enjoying the flexibility and reduction in commuting time or remote work. So we are left wondering, is this return to the office mandate common to the whole economy? Is just some very large vocal companies that are doing so? And also, we don't know what are these challenges that companies are facing and how they can deal with them, and also what are actually the benefits of working from home. And in answering this big, very important question, we decided to partner up with the Confederation of British Industry, which is the largest industry lobby association in the UK, representing more than 190,000 members. And these allow us really to scale up the coverage of our survey. And we had a great response rate. We fielded the survey last July, and we had more than 800 responses. And what is most important is that contrary to other studies in the literature that mostly focus on startups or very digital companies, we cover most of the UK economy. We cover all type of firm sizes, as well as the manufacturing and the knowledge-intensive services sector. So we had actually a very good representativeness of those industries that engage more with remote work. And last but not least, we also covered whole regions in the UK. And the objective is really to provide a firm-level perspective, to try to unpack a bit this black box of what's going on within firms in their adoption of remote work, and what are their perceived benefits and challenges. So what do we find? We find something confirming other studies in the literature that remote and hybrid work is here to stay, is the new normal. So companies are really not reverting back to the pre-pandemic level. We find that only a minority of companies adopting work from home since the pandemic has returned to full in-person arrangements. And also only 13% are likely or very likely to mandate a 5 days a week return to the office in the near future. So remote work seems to be really a long-term structural change in how UK's businesses are currently operating. What we also find is that hybrid is the dominant model. So most of the companies adopting remote work in 2026 are really using either 1-2 days per week or a 3 to 4 days per week remote work policy. And these type of arrangements account for 75% of the firms adopting remote work in our sample. Also, what we see is that fully remote is more of an exception. So the idea that companies have mostly remote workers, digital nomads working from all over the place is a very niche business model, accounting for only 15% of the firms that we have surveyed. The other aspect dimension that we try to uncover in this study is what are the impacts of remote work on productivity and other firm level outcomes. In particular, we started with the idea of trying to figure it out why some companies have discontinued remote work, why some companies have adopted the remote work and then they reverted back to in-office, in-person arrangements. The reason why is that these companies, which are a subsample, so only roughly 100 companies in our sample, they cite as maintaining team cohesion and collaboration as the main issues, main challenge of remote work, as well as monitoring productivity and work output. Then we ask ourselves, okay, but so how actually the company that are continuously using remote work, that have not discontinued remote or hybrid work, how they actually, what are their experience and outcomes in terms of productivity, innovation, and business growth when adopting remote work. And what we find is that most firms report either neutral or positive outcomes. So if we look at this bar, the red part is companies that are experiencing negative effects of remote work. And we can see that less than a third of companies have negative productivity, innovation, or business growth effects. So the large majority are really benefit from it. And the persistent challenges are mainly, once again, due to training and career development and team collaboration. And I'm going to come back on this in a couple of slides. So the next question we ask ourselves is why some companies are able to benefit from remote work, why some other companies are not. So what is working and what is not working in the management of remote workers? And we found some interesting correlations showing that actually companies that report higher productivity gains from adoption of remote work are those that have invested systematically in training staff in hybrid or remote work. In particular, what we did is several analyses to identify which are the specific firm characteristics that seems to enable successful remote work. And we identified that investment in not just in training the staff, but also in adopting management practices to manage remote workers shows positive outcomes in terms of productivity, innovation, and business growth. We also show that early adopters, which are usually more digitalized, more productive firms that were already experimenting with remote work before the pandemic, also are the ones that report positive productivity effects. And these results are quite consistent, controlling for all sorts of characteristics of the firms, of the sector, of the geography, their age. So one of the key findings of our report is that successful remote work seems really to depend on organizational investment in management remote workers. So there needs to be some active investment of the company to adjust to this way of organizing work in order to make it work. But as I said, I wanted to come back to the main challenges. Since it's quite interesting to better understand why companies are so concerned about team collaboration and the potential issues that remote work may have in the innovation process. So in this bar chart, what we look at which different stage of the innovation process remote work has more positive or negative effects. And what we find is that remote work is particularly disruptive in those activities that requires face-to-face interaction, such as the idea development, so the initial creation and development of new ideas that the firms may actually later on commercialize into new products or services. That could be particularly affected, and firms need to take that into consideration when adopting remote work. In terms of benefits, we are quite consistent with the results from other studies showing that remote work is really beneficial for employees, increase their job satisfaction and well-being. And also what is important is that work from home really enlarge and expand the company's labor markets, allowing employers to recruit workers that are located farther away, and so to engage with a broader pool of talent. And this could be potentially actually positive effects of the innovation process. And this is actually what we find. So on one end, remote work may disrupt the creation of new ideas in the innovation process, but at the same time, it can allow companies to hire better talent, more diversified talent that can actually potentially increase innovative activities at the firm level. Okay, in the second part of the presentation, I let Riccardo taking over and present the last set of slides.
Thank you, Davide. Thank you very much. So, like Davide said, clearly workers, and when it comes to workers' well-being, the results for the UK are pretty much aligned with the literature for Europe, for the US, or from the large, like multi-country surveys. However, what we really need to take into account is the uniqueness of the UK firm structure. Let's see like what happens when we look at the recruitment advantages and disadvantages, and this is where like inequalities emerge. Davide, the next slide, please. Here, like we look at easier recruitment. Firms that said remote work has made it easier for me to recruit or to access a wider talent pool. And here we are looking at how this positive impact, easier recruitment changes for firms of different sizes. And we can see that for micro, small firms, this benefit is not quite there yet. Where we really see an advantage in terms of recruitment is for large firms. So 45% of large firms report better recruitment and access to a wider pool as a key benefit from the adoption of remote work. Employee retention has also been mentioned as an important benefit from remote work, but again, this benefit emerges mostly for large firms. So here we have an important point of difference vis-a-vis, for example, evidence from the US. We know that medium-sized firms are much more common in the US, while the UK firm structure is largely dominated by small and micro firms. So here, like we can see how the logic is similar, but the underlying structure of the economy is fundamentally different, calling for like a careful consideration of the specificities of the UK economy. And this is an important new piece of evidence, because what we know already is mostly like what applies to the large firms, but what this study is uncovering is the much more diversified reality when it comes to other firm sizes. Next slide, please. Of course, like the location and the structure of different businesses varies significantly in space. So when it comes to the distribution of the benefits from remote work, geography matters. Geography matters, and here what we are doing is looking at the impact on staff recruitment, focusing in particular on micro and small and medium enterprises, so the ones that are like benefiting less from work from home. The question here is, based on your experience, what impact has remote and hybrid work had on different outcomes? And here we are looking at benefits on recruitment and retention, focusing on micro and small and medium enterprises. And we can see that small firms, when they are located in London and the greater southeast, well, the access to agglomeration, access to the urban environment sort of compensate for the disadvantage of size. So even smaller firms that, of course, can be more dynamic, can be startups, in the London and greater southeast environment still benefit, feel that they can benefit from a remote work. However, similarly small firms, when they are in other English regions or when they are in Wales, in Northern Ireland or Scotland, well, that's where they struggle the most. And here, like we can almost see a sort of shadow effect, where like the large agglomerations benefit from a wider recruitment pool, from the possibility to attract talent from across the country, where smaller firms really struggle and might also face more competition from the outside, because now larger firms located in the big agglomerations start competing with the talent pool that before was accessible to them because of this sort of spatial segmentation. So this is a very, very interesting dynamic that we can uncover here, that is unique to the UK geography, if you want, but that we find consistently also in other European countries. So what are the barriers to remote work? Davide, the next slide, the barriers. So what is it that prevents the adoption of remote work? Why are some firms really not adopting remote work? The barriers here, what we are doing is looking at the remote barriers to adoption or scaling of remote work. So if firms think there are benefits, or they have identified the benefits, what is it that prevents them from doing more of remote and hybrid worker? And we see that resistance from leadership is one of the key barriers. Limited internal capacity is an important barrier, as well as an external, like infrastructural barrier, links with poor limited internet connectivity in some locations. So an infrastructural barrier that comes from outside the firm, that is outside the firm control. That's why we believe this report is very important for businesses as well as policymakers. So how can these factors be addressed? The next slide, Davide. However, here, when we think about how to address the barriers, again, there are significant differences in terms of firm sizes. Firm size shapes the importance of these barriers, how and to what extent these barriers act as binding constraints. Larger firms are more likely to encounter cultural and leadership resistance. They are less constrained by capabilities and by external infrastructural elements like accessibility to broadband. It's more an internal managerial cultural aspects that needs to be addressed, while micro and smaller firms more often face internet connectivity constraints, most likely because of their location. So even when we think about public policies, not only in terms of managerial implications, we really need to abandon a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. We really need to consider the specificities of firms of different sizes with different characteristics in places that have different characteristics and are associated with different opportunities in terms of talent pool and infrastructural endowment. Let me briefly sum up and join some reflections on the implications from what we have just discussed. So like we said at the beginning, some of the evidence that we have discussed is in line with sort of the conventional wisdom and what has been taken on board by the House of Lords report on remote and hybrid work. Hybrid work is the new normal. This is now part of our experience, like James mentioned at the beginning, of our daily experience as workers. However, that's important to keep in mind that when it comes to the UK, the most common arrangement is between 1 and 2 days. So it's really about hybrid work. It's not about fully remote digital nomads. Productivity effects are mixed. So there is no clear-cut message here about positive or negative impacts. They are rather mixed. There is, again, not one single answer that applies to all firms. And the outcomes vary significantly by firm size, sector, and geography. What is the main challenge? Clearly, and this is where the productivity challenge steps in, more on the long term, collaboration is the primary challenge. And we do know that collaboration is really the key enabling factor for innovation, and innovation is the key driver for productivity. So this is a very important primary challenge, how to make sure that these hybrid arrangements do not clash with the objective of making the UK economy more competitive, more productive, and more innovative. Well-being is clearly, and here there is agreement across countries, across firm sizes, clearly the well-being of the workers when we hit the sweet spot. So clearly this links with the idea we are not going fully remote. It's not really about working in our lounge 5 days a week. It's really the effective hybrid arrangements can reconcile well-being with still the possibility to benefit from urban amenities and from your company environment. What is the new evidence, however, that we uncover when focusing on the UK through this survey? Work from home adopters report mostly neutral or positive outcome in terms of productivity, well-being, recruitment, very important, and innovation. So yes, there are 3 organizational enablers that Davide, I think, highlighted very well. Early adoption, there is nothing that we can do about that, but early adoption, like being early movers, clearly shows some sort of accumulation of capabilities to deal with the remote working. Investment in training and formal management practices. This is very important, and I hope we will be able to go back to this in the discussion. Innovation suffers. That's like a potential problem when looking ahead in terms of the long-term impacts for productivity. Early stage ideas generation, where you need more the face-to-face contacts, are the ones that are most negatively affected. Remote works create benefits in terms of recruitment, but these benefits are uneven. Micro, small and medium enterprises struggle to benefit and might suffer the shadow effect that I mentioned before. Large versus small firms see a similar divide. The main barriers, again, vary sharply by firm size. Again, a message of heterogeneity. Leadership resistance can be the main constraining factor for large firms, while infrastructural issues, poor internet connectivity is an example of the barriers for smaller firms. Final slide, Davide, please. Implications. Like we said, there are implications for the business world and in terms of public policy. For businesses, the key message is that investment in human capital, investment in targeted training is the key to make remote work work. The adoption of managerial practices dedicated to the management of remote workers. So that's really about, okay, we cannot reproduce in a virtual environment what we were used or what we are used to do in the office. We need to rethink how we manage workers, structured check-in, revised KPI, virtual team building are just some examples of what can be done in practice to make remote work deliver in a remote environment. And the other issue is like create space for innovation, protect space for spontaneous, often serendipitous interaction. This has important implications for public policies. I don't want to spend too much time here because I'm sure members of the public will have questions, but that's about supporting managerial capacity building. It's something that in particular for budget constraints, small and medium enterprises, that's where the government can make a difference in the forms of fiscal incentives, vouchers, training modules. Focus on remote team management could help and narrow the gap, narrow the adoption gap. Improve digital infrastructure. So improve digital infrastructure, in particular, the final part of the connectivity is very important. Poor internet connectivity is something that can be addressed through infrastructural investment. And then address inequalities, special inequalities in remote work benefits. It's really the wider, like regional development policy that here kicks in order to balance the UK economy and give all firms, wherever they are, the possibility to benefit from digital technologies. And this is where like the next steps really kick in, like where we want to bring this research next, using in-depth interviews that are also part of this research design, going back to some of the firms that responded to the survey to help us answering fundamental questions in terms of, okay, what type of managerial practices definitely work in practice, which ones don't, what type of training are the ones that have successfully adopted the remote work have invested on, which are the ones that have been attempted and didn't deliver. So in order to shed light on best practices, on things that work and things that do not work, again, being fully aware of differences in terms of firms, environment, sizes, and geographies, knowing that possibly different answers, different recipes in terms of managerial practices and public policies need to be place sensitive, be sensitive to the characteristics of the place and the wider ecosystem in which they then are implemented. Just to close, a big thanks, of course, to Davide as the co-author, but also Manika, who is the other co-author of this report, who did a fantastic job supporting this project. Thanks to CBI as a fantastic partner in this endeavor. And of course, thanks also to the LSE Research Impact and Support Fund for making this possible. Thank you very much. James, you are on mute.
Sorry, thank you very much for that, Davide and Riccardo. Let me pass over the mic, as it were, to Paul from the Data City. Over to you, Paul.
Marvellous. Thank you, James. Yes, really, really interesting work. So very briefly, why am I here? Well, as James said, I work for a data company called the Data City now. But for 16 years before that, I was at the think tank Centre for Cities and did a lot of research on the impact of remote working and lived this journey that we've been on. You know, it's interesting. I remember sitting in my kitchen during lockdowns, being rang by journalists saying, well, remote work means that cities are dead now, aren't they? We're just all going to work in our little cells now. And I was like, no, that's not true. But here are the reasons why. But that was very much, I think, the thinking, certainly in 2020 and into 2021, is that there was this national consciousness that we were just going to work remotely. And I think the journey we've been on since has been really, really interesting. So let me sort of remind you of that. Hopefully you don't get PTSD from doing it, but remind you of that by pulling in then some of the threads that I think Davide and Riccardo have pulled up from their research, which I think are really interesting and things that we need to think about. So in sort of that 2020, 2021 period, I think the idea largely was that we would be at the work from home, that we would be unshackled from the office. But I think that the challenges around that were probably twofold. I think one was that the discussion was only ever seen through the eyes of the employee. And there were two actors here. There's the employee and the employer. It was only the employee. And also, I think there was this idea that productivity is just something which is, I personally have a to-do list and I need to work through it. And if I'm in an office, it stops me from working through this list, and therefore I'm less productive. But actually, that's a bit of a misunderstanding of what productivity is. And I think that's where the potential challenge is in the future. So let me come back to that point in particular in a minute. We then have sort of moved through in this journey to where we are today, which is, as Davide said, the 5-day-a-week working from home model is now a niche model, despite what the thinking was in 2020. We seem to be in a position of about 2 to 3 days a week on average of people working in an office. And what that tells us is that we have shifted and we've moved away from this idea that it's just seeing the eyes through the employee and being, oh, isn't it all great for well-being, to people understanding that there is a benefit to face-to-face interaction and there is a benefit to being in the office, because we've seen this relatively natural move back to working these numbers of days in the office. And that can only have happened because we've acknowledged that actually being together with other smart people in the same room is important from a collaboration perspective, from an ideas perspective, all the things that the agglomeration literature would tell us about. But the question then is, well, what next? Are we now in the new normal? Is this the new normal? You know, of 2 to 3 days a week in the office, 1 to 2 to 3 days at home, or will we see this continuing change? Now, are we still in the process of getting back to where we were in 2019? As you said, the halcyon days, I would probably agree with that, being a dinosaur as well, but that's all my biases laid bare. But has this journey finished and this is the destination, or should we expect to see a move further back? And I think there's, the way trying to understand that, I think, is to think again about the costs and the benefits that different people face, and the short-term costs and benefits and the long-term costs and benefits. So I think that the short-term costs and benefits of being able to work from home are very obvious. And again, I think this has driven a lot of the discussion, that people go, well, I don't have to commute anymore, which saves me time and it saves me money. I can then pick up the kids more easily, or I can empty the dishwasher or whatever it is and fit that in around my working day. That's really good, and those benefits are really realizable in terms of their implications. But there's a challenge here, I think, in terms of the longer term impact. And I think the short term implications are very visible. The long term implications are not visible at all. But it did actually come through in the research to some extent. So those long term potential implications of us not having as much collaboration, as much face to face interaction, is that we don't develop new ideas as quickly. We don't then move up on productivity as quickly as what we might otherwise have expected within a work from the office world. Now, how that plays out is, you're sitting there at your desk and someone else is having a conversation. You go, oh, that's really interesting that you've said that. Did you know about this and that? And have you spoken to somebody else? It's that spontaneity, being able to exchange those ideas and information that can push us on. If you're working in, remotely in your bedroom or your kitchen table, all that information gets lost because you're working individually as on your own rather than being part of a team. If you're in early stages in your career and you're sitting next to someone who's been in the game for 15 years and you see how they conduct themselves with a difficult client, you see how they overcome a problem, you're literally just observing it. That's a way of you on-the-job learning, of absorbing all this information. Again, if you're doing that remotely, you lose all of that. That information gets totally lost. Now, the long-term implications there are twofold. One is that the company isn't pushed on from a productivity perspective, which has implications for the company, but also then implications for the national economy. The second one is that you as an individual will not see your wages increase as quickly because your productivity is not increasing as quickly, is what I would contend. And so there's a challenge here, though, because that is very intangible and you can't really measure those things. And I don't think we'll ever pick that up in the data, is that this potential long-term cost then sort of seeps through the economy without us ever really realizing that it is there. And so the question then about where we might end up going from here is, are we at the final destination now, or will we continue to see a return back to work? Will probably be how obvious some of these longer term costs become. And actually, do we then see that people aren't progressing as much, that wages aren't rising as quickly, firms aren't being as productive in the longer term, which we think is because of this lack of collaboration, or will we not realize that? But that was the really interesting thing that came up from the slides, was that firms were saying that remote working, or a minority of them were saying that remote working was having a negative productivity impact, and yet a much larger amount of them were reporting that collaboration was more difficult to do in a hybrid or remote working world. Now, let's follow that thought through. If we think collaboration is important for ideas generation, that would suggest that this long-term hidden cost actually is not just me sort of prophesizing that this is the case, but actually something that we should very well be aware of. And I think that's where the debate is now, is it 3 days a week in the office is fine, and the 2 days, don't worry about it because we get the 3 days worth of interaction? Or is this cost coming in from not having that spontaneous interaction for those 2 other days? And I shall leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Paul. That was very, very thought-provoking. Really very interesting what you say on the kind of long-term costs and benefits. And it sounds like long-term benefits to employees. Short-term costs. I get my long and short-term right round. Okay, short-term benefits to employees, accrue to employees, and the long-term costs are borne by the firms. Riccardo and Davide, what do you think? What's your sense of that about how those differential effects play out, and both kind of over time and among participants?
Davide, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great point. I really like it, the way you frame it. Actually, it's a great way also to frame, I think, the parts of the report. There are definitely short-term benefits, not just to employees, but also to the company. The companies are experiencing easier recruitment, right? So they can immediately start hiring people that they couldn't hire before. This is something that they already been doing, and there are evidence that companies are expanding the labor markets. And there are the evidence that this has improved the inclusion in the labor markets, allowing caregivers, especially women, to join labor markets. So There are definitely some short-term benefits, and I think the report does a good job in highlighting them from the firm perspective. But you're totally right that it's not clear what are the long-term costs. In particular, we highlight that there are these disruption to the initial stages of the innovation process. I think what we want to do, as Riccardo said, in the future is to try to see whether specific type of managerial practices, so how we manage workers, can actually make up for these losses in serendipity. For example, what we show is that if we invest in managerial practices like structured check-ins, like virtual water cooling, or if you move from in-person to output-based measure of performance evaluation, this type of changes in the way you organize teams and workers can actually improve how the company is going to react in terms of perception in productivity, innovation, and so on and so forth. So I think that's where I agree with you. That's where we're going. This report, I think, is pointing in that direction. It finds some interesting suggested evidence that that is the case. And I think the next step is really to pin down how to make these remote workers interact efficiently without losing all this face-to-face interaction and all the benefits that comes from that.
Yeah, interesting. I'll just say to all the participants here in the virtual room, please do send in questions for our panel, and I'm sure you've got lots of thoughts about, I mean, your interactions with the labour market, but your own what you think of the report and the data and what the challenges are. I actually have several questions from one of our audience. So this is a question. Do you find any evidence in the impact by extent of remote work? I.e., I'm wondering if there are those that are doing perhaps 1 day per week, it didn't make much difference, whereas more days a week exaggerated the benefits and costs of that remote work at the firm level.
Well, if I may, I think this is an interesting question. Like, where is the sweet spot?
Yeah, indeed.
And definitely, I think firms like those that have adopted the remote work have attempted and have gone into an equilibrium that, at the moment, at least, I think very rightly Paul was highlighting, what is what are the differences in terms of the short-term arrangements and the capacity to capture the longer-term impacts. However, what we see is that like the 1-2 days seem to be there. That's why we have put a lot of emphasis on this idea. We don't have this fully remote environment. That's absolutely like an extreme case. We are more in a world of hybrid work where firms have settled for something around 1-2 days. With some firms going for up to 3 days. So this seems to be like where firms have settled, and this seems to be where they feel like they have identified the right balance. Of course, the question is how and to what extent more like benefit could materialize with a similar equilibrium interacted with more supportive managerial practices, rather than trying to reproduce the same type of office interactions that we have in person, rather than translating them into online interactions, trying to see how we can rethink the way in which we interact, how we organize the business day differently to accommodate a hybrid style of work. The typical example is, okay, if people come to the office, but then they continue to hit their to-do list in the same way as we did before. So every day looks like the same, just some of these days are at home, others are at work. And yes, people are interrupting me. I am like over here in conversation in the water cooler, and I cannot go through my to-do list. So yes, if this is the model, it is difficult there are it's difficult to see like the full benefits of remote work. Maybe we need to rethink the organization of work, and that's where like we are trying to point out with the more qualitative analysis. But I think this is critical to what Paul was highlighting before. What are then the long-term benefits? Is this really an equilibrium or not? This we don't know.
Yeah, yeah. One thing, a question on the kind of what is optimal and what you might see over the long term. I mean, I think perhaps this is a question for you, Paul, too, particularly, is that someone's written in on the question to say, well, actually, what you'd expect over the long term is that the firms that perhaps if they have if mandates result in higher productivity, those firms will be successful, and therefore over the long-term attrition will mean that actually those firms survive. The ones that have remote work will go under, and they'll be replaced by firms that are more inclined to have more presenteeism. Paul, what do you think on that?
This is such a great question and so well phrased. Because my response to that is yes. Is that okay. my assumptions is that because if we think that collaboration and face-to-face interaction and serendipity of knowledge exchange is important, then those companies that do more of that, if we assume we can't replicate that in a virtual world, I'm quite skeptical that we can do that, but maybe I'm wrong. So we assume that you do need to have that face-to-face interaction to have that knowledge exchange happen as efficiently as possible, then yes, those firms that do more of it, you'd think would have the competitive edge, and that would then push them on. I think that was why I personally have not been surprised that we've seen a return back to the office. I was quite a lone voice saying this in 2020 and 2021 and caused a couple of stirs by saying it at the time as well. Whereas now actually, people accept that. We think, oh, yes, we've moved back to the office. What I am surprised at is that it seems if the return to work in the UK, or in London at least, where we've got slightly better data through TfL, that return to work seems to have stalled more recently. And I'm quite surprised that we haven't continued to see this return, not just as competitive, the more competitive firms, the ones that sort of push out the ones that are potentially less competitive on this point, but actually the more competitive employees haven't pushed out the less competitive employees too, where you would think that, well, actually, if somebody's going in 5 days a week and collecting all this extra information, that allows them to be promoted more quickly than somebody who doesn't. And then decisions about who gets recruited or not then or kept on sort of play into that. And that hasn't played out. I am surprised by that. Two things on that. First, I think the follow-on question is that might be because the workers have decided that there is a trade-off here, and they decide to trade off productivity benefits and wage increases from the fact that they get extra flexibility. And that's totally rational. And maybe that is a good position for us to be in. From an economist perspective who wants to grow the size of the economy and measure productivity through the way that we traditionally measure it, I'm a little bit horrified by that. But actually, maybe that increase in flexibility increases standards of living to the extent that people are willing to have the monetary trade-off to have that. And I totally get that. But the second element where you could end up having sort of a cultural element within a country, of that being the case, that we sort of made this national subconscious decision to take that front. Where the second element of competitive pressure might come in might be from abroad. That if there are other countries in the world where actually there's been a quicker return to the office, therefore more collaboration, more face-to-face interaction, it might be that the UK economy starts to get squeezed because other competitive economies elsewhere in the world are not following the same practices. And indeed, some of the evidence that Davide put up at the start suggested that the UK was doing more hybrid working than is the case elsewhere. So it'll be really interesting to see how this journey continues to play out.
Super interesting. On management practices, one other element, one of the questions come in is about the changing nature of the workspace. And I did a story back in September 2019, I think, on the kind of changing nature of offices. And I went to Goldman's new office in London and was very impressed by that. And I went to a WeWork, and I went to an office with a climbing wall in it. And so the question here is, are you seeing kind of the kind of flight to quality in the London office market and other prime office spaces in cities that are designed for kind of collaboration in mind, and that kind of 2-3 day a week optimum, not optimum, but 2-3 a week norm, let's say?
Shall I have a quick stab at that and then bring others in as well? So
Go ahead, yeah.
Anecdotally, that seems to be the case. That's something, a story that people get told. And I think there's an idea from companies that, we have to try and lure people in to get them to come in by giving them lots of home comforts and other sorts of things. Interestingly, though, when we ran a survey on London workers at Centre for Cities, quality of work environment actually wasn't something that came up particularly highly in the factor that was swaying people as to whether they were travelling or not. Things like transport costs were much more important. So probably around the edges, that sort of thing, if you've got a nice office to go into, probably might help tip you in one way or the other, potentially, if you're right on the margin. But it didn't feel like it was a big swing for a number of people, which is where I think it was interesting when we then did a similar survey in Paris, where and talk about the different benefits. Actually, transport costs were much less of an issue in Paris because of the way that the French labour market is structured, is that the employer pays at least part of your commuting costs. And so actually one of the bigger barriers for getting people in is not so much of an issue in Paris. And then we see higher working from the office as a result. So it's quite interesting, I think, the perceptions about these things and actually maybe how they actually influence employee choices.
I think, if I may, James, that if we think about like this work, like new digital offices, even going around some of the government offices, they seem like more structure for remote work. So you find like lots of these pods for online meetings. So people like are sort of expected to come to the office to then isolate themselves into these pods to have online meetings with others that are working from home. Or it might happen that you show up for a seminar in person and then most of the attendees from that office are connecting from home. So I think at the moment, the place where we are also in terms of designing office spaces is linked with the managerial practices point that we have made before. So space needs to be shaped by its use and by new ways of managing, and therefore like designing spaces that are supportive of these new managerial practices. So that people are not assume, okay, you don't come in really for the cookies that you get or the sweets, or maybe even the gym membership that some offices have included in the bundle. It's really like if the office is conducive to something that adds value, that becomes a lot easier to reach out to my team, to discuss things face to face rather than by email. Being in the office works so well also in terms of like sometimes emails might sound, in particular in international environments, might sound in a way that is not conducive to the best forms of interaction. Just meeting someone outside your door and having the same chat face to face completely changes the tone of the interaction that can then continue by email. So again, that's a matter of how the office is designed in coordination and to support new and different managerial practices. The second point that I would like to make is that the trip to the office becomes more and more a bundle of experiences where the urban environment matters. Coming to center, that's where the prime location of the office matters. It's not only like what happens inside the office, but it's also the location of the office in relation to the wider urban fabric. Coming to central London means benefiting from a large number of other cultural and social amenities that make the trip to the office like more rewarding. You can see your friends because even if they don't work inside in the same company, they might be in nearby offices. So it's easier to meet in central London rather than from someone, I don't know, from Crouch End and from Greenwich to be able to meet during the weekend because it takes so long. So I think that's also about reflecting about the office and the design of the office is in its interaction with the wider urban environment and the bundle of amenities that come with that.
Yeah, very interesting. A question on whether there's. I'm going to try and do two questions for the price of one here. So, is there any relevant research on kind of the types of tasks that can kind of maximize the benefits and minimize the costs of working from home? And then there was another question on kind of sectoral differences as well. So different tasks and different sectoral effects. Presuming plenty of them.
Yeah. let me give my thoughts very briefly. So I haven't seen any research on different tasks, or there may well be some out there, and colleagues might know of some. But I think you can sort of imagine those types of things where you've got to get your head down and write a report, or you've got some coding that you need to do without any interruption and solid thought. That those things do probably lend themselves more not to be interrupted. Well, I think the challenge with that is that it assumes that you can segment your working week up like that. Now, to some degree, you might do, but what if you decide to do your working from home tasks on a Monday, but then all of a sudden there's a colleague who's got a bit of a crisis that's come out of nowhere, and you're not able to respond to that? And I think it is the serendipity of these things and the unpredictability of these things too, that the thing that we don't tend to think about when we say, oh, we can just segment these things up. So Tuesday to Thursday was when we collaborate, and then Monday and Friday is when we go into our shells. But you just can't predict what's going to happen. And I think that's the real challenge to all of this, and that it would be really neat if we could separate those things out. But the reality is, I think the world's much fuzzier than that.
Davide, do you want to add something on the sectors, maybe? Because I think that's a very important point, if I may, also with reference to manufacturing, in the sense that I think if we go into sort of London-based, high knowledge intensive services experience, we might get a different sense vis-a-vis the impact of remote work, vis-a-vis when remote work is applied to some jobs that interact with other jobs that are done on the factory floor. And that's where big challenges emerge, because you might need that type of feedback loop, not only among office workers, but also between people in the office or people in the lab, and then people that actually do things, or that interact with customers, then deal with the logistics in physical terms. So that's also where big challenges emerge. There are technological solutions where you can get more and more real-time information on your computer. If a doctor can check x-rays or even operate remotely, then this suggests that now lots of things can be done across distance in a much more effective manner. Even the triage in emergency rooms, part of that can be delocalized. The question is, what is the effectiveness of this, and how and to what extent different injections of digital capabilities, as well as training and managerial practices, need really to be put on steroids in particular sectors to make this possible. Otherwise, the risk is that some sectors try to imitate, or some firms need to follow because of the pressures, for example, the demands by the employee, pathways followed in other sectors, but they might face big barriers that might act as significant constraints in their particular reality, where they are in their sectors. David, I don't know if you want to chip in here.
I don't want to hold the participants any longer, but we have a lot of results at the end of the report, especially looking at different effects across different sectors, across especially manufacturing versus office-based industries. So we have lots of further results in the report. So I recommend you to have a look at it. And there is way more than what we presented today inside.
Brilliant. Thank you, Davide. And with that, I shall wrap up. So yeah, thank you, Davide and Riccardo, for the paper. Super interesting. And as you said, there's loads to dive in here. Thank you, Paul, for your thoughts, and for echoing my thoughts on the halcyon days of 2018 and 19. I mean, a few anecdotes to leave us with. I mean, I think when I do come to the office, I try not to go to my desk and spend much time there. And I think I always feel slightly guilty about spending so much time away. And I think my fellow data journalist must wonder what's he doing, going for 6 coffees in a single day. But that's what I find is kind of the most productive use of especially in a knowledge rich environment where ideas are really, your whole capital is on the strength of your ideas. And with that, I think I would say also, very interesting on management practices and how office design and the shape of the office and the architecture really informs our ability to come up with very good ideas. and I've been quietly lobbying my colleagues to try and find some money to actually rethink the design of the editorial space, because I don't think actually it lends itself very well to that really this kind of the kind of 2-3 day week average, and that kind of knowledge transfer that you need. And also I'm also, when I wear a tie nowadays, I'm always asked, what the hell are you doing wearing a tie? And it is my one man campaign to bring back the tie and bring back a bit of formality in a strange and informal way. So so with that, I will leave you with that thought. And thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for your questions. Super interesting. And with that, I'll bid you adieu.
Thank you. Thank you, James.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Thank
All
you,
the best.
everyone.
Bye-bye.